March is Women's History Month, and now more than ever, we are reminded of the importance of understanding women's historical experiences. Historic sites were not just inhabited by men. Countless women have left their own mark upon the landscape through lives that often went unremarked upon and unrecorded. This does not mean, however, that their stories aren't valuable. Understanding how women, particularly the ordinary women, who were far more common than a Martha Washington or an Abigail Adams, lived throughout history only serves to expand our conception of the past, giving us a richer view of how we got to where we are today. It's easy, however, to talk about how important women's history is, how we need to integrate women's stories into our historical narrative. Harder still is actually doing it, diving into the historical record and piecing together the lives of women who were often legally non-existent, who may not have had the same educational opportunities as men, whose letters may have been burned after their deaths, who for many years could not hold public office or vote. Today, I will be offering a roadmap, some suggestions for how to approach uncovering women's experiences at a historic site and how to integrate it into interpretation, particularly at house museums. Using the Van Riper Hopper House, which is part of the Wayne Museum, as a case study, I'll be discussing which databases I consult, types of records I'd recommend looking into, especially when faced with a lack of family correspondence, and how I've begun melding archival sources and material culture into interpretation for the public. Now, I should be clear, this is not going to be the end-all be-all. There are definitely sources I haven't consulted yet. There are archives and other resources that can be tapped. And when I conclude, I'll offer just a couple of suggestions for where I'll be going next and where you might go next. Hopefully, though, this will be a guide for those embarking upon their own women's history research in how to go about it. So for some brief context, the Van Riper family originally came to Wayne, which was then a part of Bergen County, in the 1760s, when Richard Van Riper purchased about 150 acres of land here in the area. In 1786, his eldest son Uriah married neighbor Maria Berdan, who belonged to another of Wayne's early Dutch families. Richard gave the couple a portion of his property on which the Van Riper Hopper House was built upon their marriage. Uriah and Maria developed their land as a farm, and their 5 generations of descendants would follow suit. Unfortunately, while we don't have specific records about what they grew, agricultural records for mid-19th century Wayne list various types of livestock, so milk cows, cattle, oxen, pigs, and horses, as well as produce like potatoes, wheat, rye, oats, buckwheat, corn, hay, butter, and honey. While relatively unknown today, the Van Ripers were active in their local community. They attended services and financially supported Preakness Reformed Church. They were involved in township and county politics, and they kept in touch with extended family members and friends in places like Patterson, Fairlawn, and beyond. We also know that from the early to mid 1800s, the Van Ripers were enslavers and owned at least 3 African-American individuals whose labor in and outside the Van Riper Hopper House supported the Van Ripers' farm and lifestyle. And for some context, as per the 1830 census, Saddle River Township, which included the property of the Van Riper Hopper House and would eventually contribute to Wayne Township, had the highest percentage of enslaved people to property owners of all future Passaic County townships. Following the abolition of slavery, the Van Ripers hired paid workers who lived and worked on their property. Van Riper descendants lived in the Van Riper Hopper House up until the 1920s, when they sold the home and surrounding property. While there were several families who rented and later purchased the property following the Van Ripers' residency, today I'll be focusing on the Van Ripers' time at the house, so from 1786 to the 1920s. So we'll start at the very beginning, which, though a very good place to start, can be a tricky place to define. Uncovering women's lives at a property is obviously a complex topic, and so I've broken it into 2 thematic sections. So first comes identifying the women of the Van Riper Hopper House, so learning their names, birth dates, death dates, etc., and then finding their personalities, so what their lives might have been like, what they did day to day, and such. My focus in the identification section was on women who were related in some way to the Van Riper family, who, as I mentioned, occupied the home from its construction in 1786 until the 1920s. I'll admit that, thanks to the dedicated work of the Wayne Historic Commission and former curators here at the Wayne Museum, I did have a bit of a head start. So I was presented when I started this research with an already existing Van Riper Hopper family tree, which included 7 women who you can see here on the slide in pink. They were Maria Burdan, Mary Van Riper, Anna Banta, Mary Ann Van Riper, who was the only woman to actually inherit the Van Riper Hopper house, as well as Mary Ann's 3 daughters, Anna, Mary, and Helen. So all this to say that I had a bit of a head start on this research, but the process that I'll be discussing to find other women still proves useful. So to find any remaining Van Riper women, I first turned to Ancestry.com, which is a genealogy database that compiles digitized sources, such as census records, church records, military records, city directories, passenger lists for trips, and more. Generally, Ancestry is searchable by individual. You can plug in names, birth and death dates, names of parents and siblings, and home location to find any relevant records. Of course, this makes it difficult if you're searching for women whose names you don't know. And so I began by searching the names of the men who inherited the Van Riper Hopper house. That was Jacob, Uriah, and the second Uriah, to see what I could uncover about the female members of their households. Wills and census records were 2 of the types of records that proved most fruitful in this initial search. Excuse me. So I will be the first to admit that I find wills to be very daunting. They can be filled with legal jargon, winding land descriptions, and more, but don't let that scare you. Wills are a fantastic source for mapping out families, both genealogically and geographically. Consulting the wills of Uriah R. Van Riper, who built the Van Riper Hopper house, and his son, Jacob B. Van Riper, produced 4 women related to the Van Riper family. Uriah's 1840 will mentions his daughter Elizabeth, married to a DeWitt, whom he left $500, as well as, quote, the homestead and farm where she now resides in the township of Saddle River, containing 85 acres in 2 lots. Jacob's will mentions his 2 daughters, Leanne, wife of Cornelius Kipp, and Mary Elizabeth, wife of Nicholas Geroloman, who both became property owners on their father's death, inheriting houses and lots in Patterson, as well as a pew in Preakness Reformed Church. Jacob's will also included a note for his son Uriah to, quote, take care of my colored woman during her lifetime, suggesting the presence of an African-American woman at the Van Riper Hopper house as of Jacob's death in 1856. So generally, wills tend to focus on close family members, especially those surviving at the time of the author's decease. And so to fill in the remaining gaps, I turn to Ancestry's collection of federal census records. So for New Jersey, their surviving records date from about 1840 to 1940. Searching by the male head of household once again, I was able to find other women who occupied the Van Riper Hopper house, including Sarah Van Riper, who was the daughter of Anna Banta and Uriah Van Riper, as well as Sarah Banta, who was Anna's mother and lived with the family circa 1860 when she was 74. You can see her name highlighted near the bottom of the list here, just above Anna Banta's mother-in-law, Mary Van Riper, who actually lived with her son and daughter-in-law in 1860, but was considered her own household and actually owned her own property. Census records, however, can also help to expand the definition of women at the Van Riper Hopper house, accounting for paid servants and enslaved women who occupied the home and whose labor supported the Van Riper's lifestyle and livelihood. Locating the households of each of the Van Riper inheritors from about 1850 to 1880, 4 women were identified as servants over the course of those years. There was Annick, who was likely the same as Adriana Van Riper, Hagar Ogden, Sarah Ogden, and Susan Ogden. Annick, listed as a 66-year-old African-American woman in the 1850 census, was likely the colored woman who was mentioned in Jacob B. Van Riper's will, and I'll actually be discussing her life in more detail further on. The Ogdens first appeared in the 1850 census. They were listed as mulatto women, Hagar aged 47 and Sarah aged 21. Susan, who may have been Sarah's daughter, appears first in the 1870 census at age 9. The 1830 census is also the first surviving census to include records of the Van Ripers as enslavers. Uriah Van Riper is listed as owning an enslaved woman between the ages of 36 and 54. Birth and baptism records, some of which can be accessed digitally on Ancestry, are another place to turn to identify women and their familial connections. The Van Ripers were longtime congregants of Preakness Reformed Church, and the church's baptism records, which survive from 1831, include the births of all Van Riper women since that year. Similar to census records, though, birth records can also extend past Van Riper family members. Following the passage of New Jersey's 1804 Gradual Abolition Act, enslavers were required to report children born to enslaved mothers after 1804, as the act specified that these children would legally be freed upon reaching the ages of 25 for men and 21 for women. Some of these records have been digitized and can be found on Family Search, which is another genealogy database similar to Ancestry. In 1824, Uriah Van Riper, the first that is, put his pen to paper, reporting, quote, 2 Black children born at his house to offer on record. The mother of these children is named Anik. Anik, who was likely the same enslaved woman noted on the 1830 census, gave birth to a daughter, Dinah, on October 12, 1811, and a son, Cuff, on April 8, 1818. So the slide here shows the results of my first part of the research, the identification part, an expanded family tree and a list of free and enslaved women who labored for the Van Ripers. So you have identified women who lived at your historic site. What comes next is the challenge of finding out who these women actually were, finding personal details in a historical record that rarely prioritizes women's words or experiences. So in this situation, where do you even start to gather information on women's lives? Turning back to Ancestry, as a database that compiles genealogical records, it can provide several options for sources to move forward. For example, the US Census has, over the years, asked a variety of questions that can provide glimpses into the lives of those answering, including education, literacy, and occupation. For example, the 1900 census lists Mary and Helen Hopper as at school. While 15-year-old Mary may have had to travel further for high school, 10-year-old Helen may have attended classes at Upper Preakness School on Hamburg Turnpike, where textbooks included a speller, books on grammar, history, geography, and mathematics, as well as Webster's Dictionary. Mary Ann Van Riper and her husband Andrew Hopper apparently placed value on their daughter's education, as the New Jersey State Census records note that both girls attended school into their later teens. In contrast, the census also shows the absence of education. The 1860 census, for example, notes that Adriana Van Riper, Hagar Ogden, and Sarah Ogden, the Van Ripers' 3 paid servants, were all, quote, persons over 20 who cannot read or write, suggesting the lack of equal education opportunities for African-American women in mid-19th century Wayne. The occupation or industry column can also provide information about women's employment, though it's not always quite reliable. In the 1905 New Jersey Census, which you can see on the bottom of this slide, Mary Ann Van Riper is listed as a farmer, accounting for her management of the family farm at the Van Riper Hopper house, while her eldest daughter Anne is noted to be a house servant, suggesting that she did household work either for her own family or for other families in Wayne or perhaps Paterson. As of the 1910 census, Mary Hopper was boarding in Paterson while working as a sales lady at a department store, likely the Quackenbush department store, which is actually mentioned later in her obituary. However, occupations for women were often kept blank or listed simply as keeping house, as seen in the 1880 census of Andrew Hopper's household, though this hardly means that they were idle. Van Riper wives and daughters contributed to farm and domestic labor, aiding with cooking, cleaning, harvesting of goods, social events at the home, and more. While I previously discussed the use of legal documents to identify women born into the Van Riper family, this type of source has also proved fruitful in providing further information about women who the Van Ripers considered property, namely enslaved women. While these sources are focused on providing an enslaver's perspective on the lives of these women, and thus often use dehumanizing language, legal documents can be useful nonetheless in tracing the movement and forced labor of enslaved women. The Van Riper Hopper House does not only contain the stories of Maria Burdan and Marianne Van Riper, but also that of Anik. She first appears in the documentary record following Richard Van Riper's death in 1807. While his wife and daughters are listed as inheritors, Anik was part of the inheritance, a part of Richard's property granted to his widow, Elizabeth, until Elizabeth's death, when Anik was to, quote, fall to the movable property. This meant that Anik could be sold to pay off Richard's remaining debts. In 1817, this sale took place as a public auction, recorded in a document called a Vendu book. Anik, who, according to later census records, was around the age of 30, was purchased by the first owner of the Van Riper Hopper House, Richard's eldest son, Uriah. Her simple listing, quote, one Negro wench Anik, valued at $125 and listed alongside a cowbell, 2 pewter platters, and a churn, represents a particularly harrowing moment in Anik's life, not knowing who she would be sold to, potentially leaving the enslaved community who lived and labored on Richard Van Riper's property, and likely in the early stages of her pregnancy with her son, Cuff. After she was purchased by Uriah Van Riper, Anik came to the Van Riper Hopper House. Both census records and Van Riper wills trace her enslavement and eventual freedom from 1830 to 1860, a record of how her labor inside the home and out on the surrounding fields and pastures supported the family's farm and lifestyle. Birth, baptism, and death records may be the initial sources considered under church records, but the category can also offer information about women's religious involvement. Donation records, for example, can illustrate women's personal financial contributions to their communities. In 1902, George W. Labaugh compiled Preakness Reformed Church's records into a book, and the Van Riper ladies' financial impact can be traced throughout the chapters. Elizabeth Van Riper, whose husband Peter DeWitt was the son of a reverend, donated $2 in 1846, quote, for the purpose of erecting a parsonage house and the requisite outbuildings on a lot containing 2 acres. When the donations towards the parsonage house were totaled 4 years later, Elizabeth had donated $11.95. Her sister-in-law, Mary Van Riper, had donated $5. Labaugh also included contemporary anecdotes in his book, further drawing connections between the Van Ripers and Preakness Reformed Church. He notes that Sarah Elizabeth Van Riper was the church organist before her 1877 wedding, and adds that Leanne Van Riper, during her marriage to Cornelius Kipp, opened her home to the pastor, Cyrus B. Durand, even when Cyrus was ill with supposed smallpox. The last archival source that I'll cover is newspaper records, which I accessed virtually on newspapers.com. Of course, the caveat here is, as with all digitized records, that you are limited by what is digitized. So in this case, the digitized New Jersey newspapers date largely from the late 19th to the 20th centuries. So while I was able to find information regarding the Van Riper Hopper ladies, newspapers weren't as helpful for earlier Van Riper women. However, from obituaries to interest articles, weddings, and family occasions, newspapers can provide a look into women's experiences. According to Patterson's The News and the Ridgewood Herald, the Hoppers were frequent attendees of family gatherings. In 1913, for example, the Hopper sisters and their mother attended the 45th wedding anniversary of their Hopper aunt and uncle. In 1927, the News reported on Sarah Elizabeth Post's 50th wedding anniversary. She and her Hopper nieces celebrated in a home, quote, elaborately decorated for the occasion with yellow and white chrysanthemums and ferns, interspersed with streamers of white and yellow satin ribbon. The News even reported on travel, reporting in 1934 that Mary Hopper and Rachel Steele embarked on an 18-day cruise to South America, traveling through the Panama Canal, which is corroborated by their appearance on a passenger list for the SS Columbia, which I was able to access on Ancestry. The Hopper sisters can also be found in newspapers post-mortem. While their obituaries aren't quite as expansive as their brothers, aspects of their lives can still be gleaned from the short passages. Mary Hopper's obituary notes, as I mentioned earlier, her employment by the Quackenbush department store, while a notice that Helen Hopper's will was filed lists the jewelry she leaves to her surviving family members. 1 diamond each from her twin diamond ring to her brother Isaac and nephew Harry, a bow knot pin with a diamond center to her nephew's wife Gertrude, and a pinky ring with a cluster of diamonds, as well as any remaining jewelry, to her sister-in-law Bertha. A brief note here that personal family documents, so journals, correspondence, and photographs, to list a few, can often play a huge role in the discovery of personality. Finding these documents in a woman's hand, however, can be a bit difficult. Lin-Manuel Miranda wasn't taking too much of a historical liberty when he wrote the song Burn. Women in the 18th century often instructed those they wrote to burn their letters. Unfortunately, the Wayne Museum doesn't have any Van Riper family letters in the collection, but we are lucky enough to have several Hopper family photographs. These are a little snapshot, quite literally, into the lives of the Hopper ladies, showing an interest in preserving family moments, both staged and more casual, the physical landscapes they inhabited, the clothing they wore, and how they grew up, as we're lucky enough to have photos from the turn of the century up until the 1920s. So on the left here, you can see the 3 Hopper sisters. We have Helen, who always seems to be lounging in chairs in her photos, as well as her sisters Anne and Mary, along with their aunt Sarah Elizabeth Van Riper Post and her daughter and husband, another source which emphasizes their family ties, as we have several photos in the collection of Sarah and her nieces together, especially following Mary Ann's death. On the right, you can see the Hopper girls 20 years earlier, photographed on the property of the Van Riper Hopper house with 2 of their brothers. On our next slide, you can see a photograph of the Hopper girls' mother. So this is Mary Ann. This was a photo taken in a studio in Patterson, as well as a photo of her daughter, Mary, which you can see to the right. She's actually photographed in front of the Van Riper Hopper house with presumably a family dog. So the slide seen here, which I will admit looks a little bit like a conspiracy board, just missing the red string, is basically the product of the research process thus far. A list of women who once resided at the Van Riper Hopper house, along with details I was able to glean from newspaper articles, wills, Vondu books, and more. So now that you've found this information, where do you go from here? When approaching this step at the Van Riper Hopper house, I put on my interpretation hat and started to consider how to make this information accessible to the public in a tour. And part of that process is considering how to integrate documentary research with material culture. So while my talk thus far has focused on archival research, objects and spaces are key to the understanding of the lives of women in the past. Material culture offers a unique perspective into the physicality, of women's experiences, allowing visitors to step into spaces where women once lived and breathed, to see and even touch objects they handled in their day-to-day lives. For women who left little trace in the documentary record, particularly enslaved women, the material world can offer a fantastic insight into their lived experiences. In practice, this insight can be found by reinterpreting material culture with an eye away from the traditional male-focused narrative, visualizing the actions of women in everything from armchairs to toasters. Take, for example, the kitchen of the Van Riper Hopper house and the life of Annick. As an enslaved woman in the 18th and 19th century, Annick was likely involved in a mix of domestic and agricultural labor. An advertisement for a 20-year-old enslaved woman from a 1734 New Jersey newspaper notes that, quote, "She does all sorts of housework. She can brew, bake, boil, roast, soap, wash, iron, and starch, and is a good dairy woman. She can card and spin at the wheel cotton, linen, and woolen." The artifacts in this kitchen, pots, pans, spinning wheels, butter churns, even the reflector oven in front of the hearth, can thus be interpreted as Annick's instruments, objects she likely interacted with day to day as she prepared meals she may never have gotten a taste of for a family who viewed her as property. Stepping into this room, then, invites us to consider Annick's lived experience. How did she move through this space and interact with the objects within it? How did the dynamic of enslaver and enslaved play out in front of this hearth? Did Maria Burdan work in the kitchen as well, surveying Annick's every move? Perhaps Annick's children worked in this space alongside her. And how did this space change along with Annick? What would it have meant for her to continue to work here, even after she was legally freed by the Van Ripers? There are no definitive answers to all these questions, but approaching the kitchen in this way offers one example of introducing the lived experience of women into a museum setting. One of the starring pieces in the Van Riper Hopper House's parlor is an 1890s parlor organ, which was made by Mason and Hamlin. While this artifact unfortunately did not belong to the Van Riper family, tax records show that the second Uriah Van Riper and his wife Anna Banta owned a pianoforte in the 1860s, which this parlor organ can tie into. It's easy to picture Sarah Van Riper practicing on a similar piece before services at Preakness Reformed Church, where, as Laban noted, she was the organist in the 1860s and 1870s. Though we may never know if she was a reluctant study or an eager musician, the parlor organ allows visitors to consider Sarah's ties to Preakness Reformed Church and her experiences as a female musician. To give a final example, portraits of Marianne Van Riper and Andrew Hopper are two of the only pieces in our collection that are actually from the house. They can be seen in the background of family photos from the early 1900s hanging on the parlor wall. The survival of these portraits allows us to put a face to a name, to see who Marianne was. However, it also offers us a glimpse into her public presentation. A formal portrait like this, done in charcoal and pastels, would have been posed. Marianne likely chose how she wanted to be represented. Here she looks back at her viewers as a young, fashionable woman, part of a family active in the county's social life, newly married, and soon to inherit her family home. The portrait's placement in the parlor means that it played a role in the Van Riper Hoppers' social life, seen by friends, family, business acquaintances, and more, who came to enjoy tea and conversation in the parlor. For example, the photo here, taken in August 1903, not only shows members of the Hopper family, like the Hopper sisters who are on the far right, gathered before Marianne's portrait, but also includes local members of Wayne's community, like Ed Marcellus, who stands in the center of the frame. Other surviving photos taken in front of the portrait include friends from Patterson, a testament to the Van Ripers' close family ties, as well as their expanded social circle. Today, however, the portrait actually hangs in the hallway. The changed location actually opens up another avenue for interpretation. As one of the first pieces seen by visitors, it introduces them to the only woman who inherited the home and whose marriage gave the Van Riper Hopper house its full name, emphasizing the presence of women on site and the role of women as property owners. So these three examples are only some of the ways in which women's stories can be integrated into museum interpretation, offering visitors a look at the lived experience of women at a historic site. So as I mentioned, this talk is far from a final project, but a work in progress, and there are countless avenues still to be taken in researching women at the Van Riper Hopper House. Due to COVID, I haven't yet consulted a physical archive outside of my department, such as the Passaic or Bergen County Clerk's offices or the New Jersey Historical Society. Beyond expanding my sources of documentary records, I hope to continue expanding the types of sources I consult, further integrating material culture to interpret the lives of women less represented by the written word. To continue the theme of expansion, I also hope to keep I just lost my place. I plan to keep expanding the definition of women of the Van Riper Hopper House, exploring the lives of women on the property and its surroundings throughout history, to include not only white colonists, but enslaved women, freed African Americans, Native American women, and other women of color who lived and worked on the property and in Wayne. As I always tell visitors on tours, stay tuned. Interpretation is not static, but changes and expands as we continue to strive for an inclusive historical narrative. So thank you.